Whatever time of day it is that you're watching this video, I hope it's been a great day so far and that you're doing well and that you know you do important work and you are loved by God just as you are. In this segment, we are going to explore a little bit about the movement from 4 courts to 3 councils. On January 1st, 2019, the United Church of Canada put into motion the largest structural change that ever occurred in the denomination. In this session, we're going to look at the movement from 4 courts to 3 councils, the reason behind it, the process towards it, and some of the implications for you as a minister. And because many of the folk with whom you minister may have spent decades working in the previous 4-court system, it's really important that you know something of each so you can help them navigate the system. Here's the state of the church. In November 2018, there were roughly 2,500 pastoral charges in 82 presbyteries and 13 conferences. In January 2019, there were roughly 2,500 communities of faith in 16 regions. Now, each of those presbyteries and conferences had a series of committees and working groups, and many of those were very active in furthering the life of the church, and particularly the life of the local congregation. In January 2019, all of that work shifted, and there was precious little direction given from the national level about what work was to be continued and how it was to be done. There were some mandated activities, but actually how to do the work was left extremely vague, and each region was left to construct its own governance structure to address those activities and responsibilities that it wanted to undertake. And so here's a rough map of how those broke down. You can see the activity, the sort of ways in which it was expressed, the court that was responsible for it, and where it shifted in the council model or to the Office of Vocation, and then some places where there are still ongoing questions. We see a couple of factors. In many cases, work from the presbytery and the conference has been joined together. Some of the work has been given to the Office of Vocation. From almost every point of view, the level of involvement and connection of those in the congregation, the connection with the region, is less than it previously was in the presbytery and conference model. For example, in the previous structure, if a congregation, a pastoral charge, was seeking a minister, 2 presbytery representatives would be appointed to work with them. And at least one of those presbytery representatives was required to be present for there to be quorum at every meeting of that needs assessment and search process. Now, the region appoints a liaison who meets with the local committee once to get them started on their assessment of needs, is available for consultation, but does not necessarily have to attend every meeting, and attends the interviews of potential candidates. That's a significant diminishing of the connection of the local congregation with the next administrative body. So the questions arise, why make the change? Well, there are 3 major factors to identify: money, human resources, and a desire for greater flexibility and adaptability. So let's begin with money. It's an easily demonstrated fact that you see United Church of Canada donors give per capita closest to the lowest amounts of any Christian group in the country. Now, of course, there are individual exceptions to that, and many of our congregations have very sacrificial givers within them. And why? But the per capita over the church reality is undisputable. And why that is a focus for much discussion, but it is a fact. At the same time, we have always had very elaborate and expensive structures. They allow us to do a tremendous amount of social justice work and mission both around the country and around the world. So we're not necessarily squandering money, we're doing a lot of work. Another reality is that when I graduated from Queen's Theological College in 1982, givings to the Mission and Service Fund stood at approximately $30 million. And that figure has remained constant for most of the 40 years since, although in recent years it has begun to dip a bit. What has not remained constant? Inflation. In other words, to equal the $30 million of 1982 in 2020, you would require over $75 million. So we are not keeping up with inflation, even while we're trying to do the same work. And I know most of us do not like to think about money as a driving factor in the work of the church, but it's also a reality. Salaries have to be paid, heat and light needs to be paid for, and so on and so forth. Prior to January 2019, there were two primary sources of funding for the work of the church. The work of presbyteries and conferences was funded through assessments on the pastoral charge. So a budget was set at conference and sent to the presbyteries. The presbyteries added a budget for their work, and the whole thing was sent to each pastoral charge, and the pastoral charges were told how much to pay. The second source of funding, and this was particularly for the work of the General Council, was through M&S. Now, there were small amounts that came from other sources, but M&S was the biggest pot of money. The Mission and Service Fund provided for various sorts of mission at home and abroad, as well as paying for governance and staffing at the national level, grants to Theological College, and other tasks as directed by the General Council. Besides being very murky, most people give to the Mission and Service Fund believing that it's going to mission. Money was going to other sources. These funds were simply not keeping up with the costs. So what else were we doing? Well, in the first instance, the United Church drew on what are called the reserve funds. These are monies that were set aside in the good years. For instance, just after World War II, when the financial coffers were full to bursting. We have been drawing on those funds with reckless abandon decade after decade since the mid-1960s. In the second place, there have been repeated and massive staff cuts at the national church level. In the 1980s and 90s, for example, we occupied a full 6 or 7 story office tower in Toronto, and each division of the church had a floor, and there were literally hundreds of staff. Since that time, there have been massive cuts. Whole ministries have disappeared, for example, in radio and television. United Church Resource Distribution has been outsourced to an American firm. United Church Resource Production has been scaled back drastically. Most physical locations, the United Church Bookroom, have been closed. Staff in other ministries have been reduced or eliminated in significant numbers. Support granted to struggling congregations have all but disappeared. Overseas personnel and support in mission partners has been significantly diminished. So from that office tower of the 1980s, we are down to 1 floor of an office building in 2020. So cuts have been made. However, it had become clear that by 2020, at the very latest, we would hit the financial wall. The reserve funds have been drawn down to the lowest possible level because a certain amount must be retained to make necessary and legally required payments in the event that the denomination should cease to exist. So you've got to keep some of that money. Beyond that, and a few other sources of income that are comparatively small, there was no extra money besides that which was coming through M&S. Something needed to be changed, or it would be the financial committee of the General Council that would be making our choices for us, and neither they nor the rest of the church wanted that to happen. Human resources. Well, the United Church of Canada created a structure of organization that expanded rapidly after World War II, and it required huge numbers of volunteers working beyond the congregational level. It was certainly the most participatory structure in Canada and may arguably have been the most participatory in the world, but it was fueled by immense numbers of volunteers. In many cases, these were women not employed outside the home. But it also grew at a time when there were fewer social diversions and fewer volunteer organizations. And a time when, this may surprise you, many employers accepted the idea that having an employee participate in wider social structures in the community was generally a good thing. So it was not uncommon for an employer to accept the fact that one of their employees was going off doing church work during the work day, and that was an acceptable thing. That structure was also made possible by a comparatively low level of cost for travel, because the structure required a truly staggering number of face-to-face meetings, both nationally and regionally. In 1965, the United Church's membership peaked, and in the decades since, we have seen an increase in two-income family, a decline in the number of available volunteers, not just because of people's level of activities, but because they are finding other places to express their desire to volunteer. As a result, the levels of governance and the multiple steps of decision-making, oversight, and resourcing became increasingly difficult to support. One often unrecognized reason for the decline in volunteers is the rapidly expanding number of part-time ministries. In full-time ministries, it's usually accepted that a certain amount of time will be given over to the work of the wider church. In part-time ministries, that often becomes a matter of some contention. If somebody's working paid work for 20 hours a week, how much of that, can any of that, be given to the wider church? And so a newer, leaner structure was hoped for. Flexibility and adaptability are major concerns, and the structure and governance model that you see undergirded in the 2010 edition of the manual was many things, but you could not call it quick to respond, nor was it very adaptable to different circumstances. It could be slow to make decisions. It often seemed to repeat the same debates multiple times over, and it certainly was not adaptable to the challenges of different local circumstances and needs, as well as to emerging opportunities that often required a quick response. Thus, increasingly from the local level throughout the entire system, various adaptations, we might call them hacks, were being used. Some of those functioned quite well, but they did so at the cost of what were deemed to be important principles. And in some cases, they actually entailed a degree of financial risk or legal liability. Some experienced this as contrary to the Spirit's call. In other cases, procedures and rules were applied without any grace and the freedom that they in fact entail. In some cases, people just don't like to be told no, and they blame the structure as too top-heavy. I'm sure you've had the experience of people saying, "I wasn't heard," when in fact they were heard and they were just disagreed with. So, for all of those reasons, there was a feeling that the United Church was being called to or forced to a review of the structures and governance of the entire church. Now, this was not a first. A major overhaul was recommended in 2003, and it was resoundingly rejected by the General Council. The truth is, we have never been good at choosing priorities, particularly when that involves saying no to somebody else's pet project. So a comprehensive review team was formed, and it did a range of consulting. The initial report recommended a two-council model, local communities of faith, and a denominational body. Well, the pushback from the church was quite intense and led to a revision which included the region as part of the structure. This led to the model into which we are now living. It was approved through remit. And so how did it respond to the concerns raised earlier about money, human resources, flexibility, and adaptability? Well, the financing of the church has utterly changed. Financing is now done through a combination of assessments to community of faith and individual donations to the Mission and Service Fund. The Mission and Service Fund now only supports mission work, broadly defined, which allows a certain percentage of administration costs related to mission, which strikes me as quite legitimate because all of that work does not happen without some degree of administrative work. And if you look very closely, the amount of money that the church spends on administration is much, much lower than most of the best-known charities in the country. Governance and salaries, on the other hand, are now supported through the assessment. The target for the assessment is 4.5% of the money that a community of faith raises for its own purpose. That money is sent directly to the General Council office, and then a portion, roughly half of the total, is filtered back to the region. Certainly, there is greater transparency. We will know without question how much money is being spent on salaries and governance, and those giving to mission will know much more clearly where it is going. The cost of running the church may have decreased, but it's too soon to tell. However, changes to the formula mean that the actual costs to the community of faith have increased. Why is that? Well, if you think of the previous model, funding for Presbyterian Conference through the assessments usually was no more than 2 to 3% of the money raised. Now it's clearly set at 4.5%. Funding for the denomination was hidden in Mission and Service voluntary offerings. Since we have a single source of monies, that's the members and adherents in the pew, it's going to seem like more money coming out of the local community of faith. Remember, again, though, the statistics about the levels of giving in the United Church of Canada. Our level of contribution through assessment is markedly less than the Presbyterians or the Anglicans. The Roman Catholics use an entirely different model, so there's no real comparison. But the comparison with the Presbyterians and the Anglicans puts the support for the wider bodies of the church into the double digits. So we're still paying less for the governance of the church, but much more than we were previously. What about human resources? Well, eliminating a level of governance should reduce the number of volunteers needed. However, that's not immediately evident. Under the previous model, we need to do volunteer staffing for 82 presbyteries and 13 conferences, and certainly there was some overlap of people between those two courts. Under the current model, we need volunteer staffing for 16 regions, which is where much of the same work is being done that Presbyterian Conference did. Plus, we need all of the volunteer staff that are required for the Office of Vocations work. So, as I said, it's by no means clear that we will require fewer people. Flexibility and adaptability. Well, again, that remains to be seen. Because the regions were left to build their own models of governance, we don't really know how they have distributed power and decision-making processes and authority. If we still retain the number of multi-stage decision-making processes, then there's probably no greater flexibility. So that's a rough summary of those questions and issues regarding the change from 4 courts to 3 councils. We'll have an opportunity to delve deeper into each of those councils and talk about this more as the term progresses. For now, thanks for watching. Have a wonderful day.